Okay, let's share a word of prayer and we get started here. Gracious God, we give you thanks for this day and the opportunity to gather around this table and talk about the life and theology of John Wesley. As offspring of Wesley, we seek to understand more his understanding of you. And whether we agree or disagree is inconsequential, because we know that all of us have a relationship with you that in such a way brings us to know the truth that you would have us know. So bless and keep us, grant that our time together may be fruitful, that we may enjoy each other's company, and that we may learn and then go forth to share your good news with others. In Christ's name, amen.
Amen.
I had two things before we start off. We talked a little bit about the issue between John and Charles and how it got a little tense. And it became particularly tense when John started ordaining preachers, because Charles saw that as the role of a Church of England bishop. And so he wrote a hymn, an anti-John hymn, which went, "So easily are bishops made by man's or women's whim. Wesley laid his hands on Coke, but who laid hands on him?" So hands on himself he laid, and took an apostolic chair, and then ordained his creature Coke, his heir and successor. So, I mean, he took an opportunity to be a little on the snide side with his brother, and chose that as John started to drift away from the high churchiness of the Church of England, Charles seemed more attached. And it may be that because when Charles got married, he settled down and connected with a local Church of England church, where John was always on the road still, even after he married. Last week, Jane Long asked a question about John's sexual orientation. And I went on, if you want to read stuff in depth, it's not Google, it's called Google Scholar. And there are all sorts of dissertations and all this kind of stuff. And I went on and just typed in John Wesley and sexuality, and a bunch of things came up. Unfortunately, in order to look at them, it's a paid service, and I wasn't going to pay the money. But if you want to pay the money, go ahead and see what you want.
Not that important.
As a reminder, we are not starting the next study on the 3rd of June. We're starting it on the 10th. So we don't add things on to Strawberry Festival week. And we're doing the Gospel of John. And again, it's not something that, if you need to miss a week, it's not going to be a big deal, because we're just going to be taking it stories at a time. It's not so cumulative. But anyway, this morning, we want to look at one of Wesley's primary theological stances. And if you're in your book, it's page 156. And it is the issue of perfectionism. And as I mentioned, one of the historic questions asked of ordinands is, are you going on to perfection in this life? And the answer is supposed to be yes. And Wesley had a...
Can't you add with doubts?
Well, you can with God's help.
With God's help.
But what's interesting is Wesley thought that we could reach a point where we were actually free from sin. He himself was never sure that he made it, but he thought that people could. It shows somewhat of a psychological oddity with Wesley to think that others might attain perfection, but he himself wasn't able to.
Is that what his prayer really reflects? Going on to perfection?
He really started something that created an issue. The idea, I don't think any of us would make a statement that we're perfect. You know, I mean, that's arrogant. To look at things like that. We all make mistakes, we all sin, we all hopefully feel sorry when we sin and try not to do it again, but you know, we're human beings. But Wesley believed that this second blessing, as he called it, was attainable by people. And in his societies, it created quite an upheaval, because it became within his societies, and even outside, more in England in general, the idea that people were grabbing hold of this and assuming that they were the ones who had achieved perfection. And in that instance, if you've ever run into somebody who's holier than thou, there were a lot of holier than thous running around.
There still
At
are.
that point. Well, yeah, absolutely. But it brought on a whole lot of things that Wesley was uncomfortable with. Some of those who claim to have achieved perfection also claim to have received charismatic gifts, like speaking in tongues, which you know, is not something we experience in today's Methodism. I mean, that's a Pentecostal church kind of movement. But let's, you know, when we throw out the question or the issue, whenever we take Holy Communion, after the invitation, we have a prayer of corporate confession, where we acknowledge that we have shortcomings. I'm assuming that what this would mean for those that really grabbed hold of perfection would be that they would have no reason to have to confess any sins, because they wouldn't have any.
Lucky them.
Lucky them or unlucky them, you know, because to live in a fantasy land, you know, most of us find that we need to live back in reality. Wesley also believed that this perfectionism was such that it was kind of like predestination almost, in a way, that once you had it, you weren't going to lose it. That there wasn't backsliding from perfection. I don't know what, after you reach it, then what's
next?
I guess advanced perfection. Perfection 102. Something.
You can relax, get your hair ready.
Did Charles ever think of himself in those categories? But
Charles seems to have been much more orthodox, and Charles seemed to be much more rational, except when it came to he and John kind of being estranged. Charles was as much a party to the estrangement as John was. And what got Charles the most was John getting married and John ordaining clergy. Those things kind of separated them as brothers, to the point, I think we mentioned last week, Charles didn't even attend John's funeral.
Mm-hmm.
Why would he want him to get married? Why wouldn't he?
Yeah.
Don't you think he'd want him to be happy? And
Well,
this is good for him?
Charles was concerned that it was going to take away from John's work. And John was the leader. And I think Charles might have been a little concerned about what's going to happen to what we built if John has to slack off or wants to slack off a little bit. It doesn't give very much credit to the class leaders and the different leaders of the societies who could keep things going. And in a way, Charles might have expressed a concern that others expressed, which is what happens to the movement when John is gone. And think about this for a little bit. Let's use a modern day model. The Crystal Cathedral, Robert Schuller, right? Built up this church from a little drive-in deal to, this mega church. Tried to ease his son into the leadership. That didn't work.
But the grandson did.
The grandson did, but they had to sell the Crystal Cathedral because they had to sell the building because they never rebounded. And for a while there, I mean, they were propping Robert Schuller up, and it was almost sad in a way that he was.
But a lot also confiscated monies and depleted the treasury so that they had no choice.
There are several times that when a charismatic leader leaves, that something happens to the group that they've led. And I don't know. I think we've seen it. We see it in small ways in some local churches where you have a real charismatic leader who goes on and people drift away.
I think the exception to that is Billy Graham.
Yeah.
Really and truthfully. People stayed with Billy Graham throughout, thick and thin.
Billy was well, you should go to his homestead if you ever get a chance to do that. It's North Carolina.
Yeah, he's...
Montreat.
Did Charles ever go back to the colonies? Or did he stay solely in England?
No, he just stayed in England then. Charles didn't have a whole lot of interest in his work outside of England. John was the one that traveled further. John was the one that recognized that America, the colonies, were changing. When the Revolutionary War broke out, Church of England clergy who were in the colonies, most of them went home. They were loyalists. And that left a real dearth of ordained clergy to do the sacraments. And that's where Wesley got into ordaining clergy. He saw it as a necessity
To fill the void.
to fill the void, and developed his theory that any presbyter, what elders, we call them elders in our system now, that any presbyter could ordain someone. It was a radical understanding, certainly, but he felt that he had no other option. The other option would be to simply allow his lay preachers to do the sacraments. And he didn't think that was, he was still too tied up with the Church of England to accept that a lay person could give the sacraments. So he gave himself the authority to ordain Thomas Coke and Francis Asbury so that they could go to America and do the sacraments.
Is that where Asbury Park comes in?
Yep.
Yeah, because my mom was raised Methodist, and I remember we used to go there, and there was you couldn't get anything to drink.
Mm-hmm.
Not that we never did that. My parents didn't do that anyhow. But I used to think, like, what are we always coming here for?
Yeah.
It's just, and then later on, I heard other people say they would go there for retreats and stuff that were Methodist. We just stayed in the big
One of the things that's interesting
boarding house.
is the number of places and things that reflect either Thomas Coke or Francis Asbury. An early college that was started was called Cokesbury, Coke and Asbury. Our Methodist Publishing House is Cokesbury. That came from Thomas Coke and Asbury. There's Asbury Seminary, obviously. It's interesting that there aren't really any churches named after Coke. Asbury seems to be the one that's more understood as the shaker and the mover of the developing America church. And it's really where the line was crossed that the Methodists were no longer a revival movement within the Church of England, but in America were their own church. So a line had been crossed, and I'm not sure Charles would appreciate that line being crossed. Again, he wasn't as radical as John was. John would claim not to be radical. He really kept insisting that people in the Methodist societies go to the Church of England for the sacraments. But I suppose once he started changing his tune about America, that England wasn't going to be far behind with that. But when he had this idea of perfectionism, his life at the time was anything but. And I think the one thing we look at is his marriage to Molly. He was awful, to the point that even when he was away, he would occasionally write a letter home. You know, that was the only form of communication. But it was always critical of Molly, either spiritually or just in terms of telling her how she should keep house and things. You know, if Molly were in arm's reach, she would have punk slapped him for some of the stuff he said. And so, with this whole perfectionism thing, we not only need to look at the theology of John Wesley, but we need to look at the psychology of John Wesley and that psychological profile. And that's one of the places where I think we find more rationalization for why he would say that we can go on to perfection, but he doubted that he was. Maybe he took an honest look at his own life and said, no, you know, it's not going to work. Or maybe the more unfortunate thing for him was not only had he not reached perfection, but because of his past, he never could. And that goes back to the psychological profile of living in the past. You know, he had to live through these 3 previous disastrous relationships that were, especially the one with Grace Murray, that was really kind of questionable as to how close this was, and did they actually exchange marital vows, and did she then marry the other guy, and was she therefore a bigamist? You know, things that today would be prime social media fodder, then I think kept rather hidden. The other area where Wesley stepped outside the bounds of the Church of England was he started letting women preach. But they weren't allowed to call it preaching. It was exhortation. Now, nobody has ever been able to define the difference for me between preaching and exhortation, but it almost seems like it was a political move to try to say, oh no, I'm not sanctioning women preachers, but they did, because in these classes and in the societies, women were more often the shakers and the movers. You know, they came out of more traditional households where the guy was working and the women raised the children and kept house and got involved in religious activities. And so he at first probably recoiled a little bit when he got a hint that perhaps there were women in the societies who were doing something like preaching. But then he came around to it. It didn't stick. We just passed the other day the 70th anniversary of women being ordained in the Methodist Church. in America. So, and you go back to 1956, and I knew Jane Harner was one of the first women ordained, and when she was, the bishop couldn't find her an appointment. It took a while.
I often see on Facebook to this day on whether women should be allowed to be preachers. You know, it's still not fully accepted all the way around, I don't think.
Well, even my mother was pretty progressive, but didn't believe that women should preach or umpire baseball games.
Didn't the Queen of England turn that around somewhat? In her speeches, she dwelt a lot on the role of women.
It changed slower in England, or slowly in England, but eventually came around. Now, one of the things that thank you, Jane, one of the things that the book points out is maybe part of Wesley's motivation to say that women could preach was the fact that he didn't have enough men. And it was the book says it was pragmatic for Wesley to do this.
So how did the women, did people take them seriously? And did the men get upset?
Some took him seriously.
Yeah.
And I'm sure that there were many male preachers who were very upset over this. There are male preachers today who are still upset. There is still, there was a pushback when, I can't remember her name, was named the Archbishop of Canterbury recently. You know, the first woman Archbishop of Canterbury. Wesley had pushback throughout his career in a way. He had pushback on perfectionism, those that really bought into it, those that didn't buy into it at all. He had pushback when he ordained clergy. He had pushback on whether or not the movement in England was a church or not a church. So I suppose in the development of any religious movement, there has been pushback of some kind. That's probably something that we have to expect for the reason that people's faith is, for many of us, the most important thing that we deal with. And if somebody's taking us in a direction that's against the one that we've traveled, we're going to be resistant, perhaps. It would be as if for communion, I asked everyone to remain in their seat, and I threw croutons out, and you had to open your mouth and if you did radical changes, and having women preach was a radical change. No matter whether Wesley called it exhortation or not, it didn't really matter. People knew what it was. And in many societies and the classes, these women were highly respected. And they were theologically light years ahead of a lot of the men. So, they really were a blessing to Wesley's movement. Now, did Charles like it? We don't have a whole lot of information from Charles, whether he was okay with it or not. He was he was pragmatic too, so he may have seen it as a necessary evil. But the movement never would have grown if Wesley had to rely on lay preachers, men, because he also got to the point where he insisted that if you were a lay preacher in his movement, you could not have any other employment. And that for some people was a toughie, because they were financing their ministry by their day job. And so what would happen would be that they would go from being kind of self-supporting to having to rely on the society that they were preaching to. And who knows whether or not those people would be generous or not. We don't know that. I did want to go back just for a second to perfectionism. Wesley saw perfectionism primarily as something that came all at once. I think that I can't speak for everybody. I can speak for me. That my spiritual development has been ongoing. It has, generally speaking, an upward trend, but that doesn't mean that it doesn't have occasional dips in it, right? And that, if anything, it's a work in progress. Wesley was under the impression that people could have an instantaneous experience, which he calls it sanctification, where they could be sanctified in an instant. Kind of like when the Apostle Paul was struck off his horse on the way to Emmaus, and all of a sudden knew everything there was to know about Jesus.
What part did the Methodist Church play in bringing women into the preaching into the pulpit? Was it automatically part of the Methodists?
Well, Methodists have led the way in the importance of women in the ministry of the church, I think. The Protestant denominations certainly were well ahead of the curve than Roman Catholicism, which, still has limitations. What's going on? You think, in a way, when does the Pope, in this instance, become pragmatic and say, wait a minute, I have nowhere near enough priests to fill all the vacancies. When do I make a move?
If they made that move, the priests could marry, there would not be a shortage.
Yeah, I agree with you. I've talked with a couple of priests who would be more than happy to see women priests, because they're being asked to stay on and on and on. And one of them, he's in his 80s, and he's tired, and has 2 churches that he does mass, Saturday night mass at 1 and then 2 masses on Sunday. And it's, unfortunately then, like there's a young guy over at Mount Carmel, younger guy, and the scuttlebutt on him is he's on the way to being bishop, so, or a bishop, but, he won't be in the parish very long. I don't know. I think that when we look at we have an issue at annual conference. I'm bad at stating the number of years, but I think it was at least 10 years ago we had a conference in downtown Philadelphia, and the ordination service was at a church, a non-denominational church, because of the size it could handle it. And there were serious objections because in that church women were not allowed to be ordained, and we were ordaining women. And some of us thought that symbolically we should have looked for a different venue. But we didn't. Once again, they didn't listen to me.
Maybe they thought it would rub off on that church.
Yeah,
So the Methodist Church were the first ones that.
one of the first,
One
yeah.
of the first.
I think one
And
of
that was in
the,
1956.
1956,
And in 1700s they were preaching.
preaching.
That doesn't make any sense.
Well, you know what, my editorial is that we need to revisit this whole ordination thing. That I recognize that it basically states that you've reached certain requirements. But there's no magic in my hands. I don't turn the baptismal water into something that is so special that why couldn't somebody else do it? Or, that there is a limitation. My personal theology is that any baptized Christian should be able to baptize someone else. And that in terms of the Lord's Supper, I don't think it's, it shouldn't have to be imperative that I say the words of institution when we do the ritual of the Lord's Supper. And this is, but it's why Wesley ordained preachers for America, because there was such a high, wasn't even respect, but a high opinion on what ordination was, that we have 94 churches in the district, and 23 are led by lay people, lay pastors. And Felker drives an hour once a month to connect with a lay pastor to consecrate his elements so that they can have communion. And we sit around and say, this is kind of stupid. But I know that I have colleagues who are very protective of ordination and are hesitant to want to broaden the pot, if you will, of who can do things. But it goes to show that we're always progressing along the way. The movement to women's ordination was really slow. And in the 50s, when it was passed that women could be ordained, it was radical. And there were churches that sending a woman to was professional suicide because they weren't going to be even given a chance to show what they could do. Anyway, Wesley had a colleague named Maxfield. And Maxfield really grabbed hold of this idea of perfectionism and took it to the point where he said that basically those who reached this state of perfection could do no wrong whatsoever. Now that's radical. It's almost, it's dehumanizing in a way to think that people turn into God's puppets, that there's no free will that allows us to go out and make the occasional mistake. Yet Wesley would continue to preach perfection, but then he would have an issue with people like Maxfield, who he thought maybe were taking it a little too far. And when I was reading that, my thought was, well, how do you take perfection too far? Perfection is as far as you can get, right? Did Wesley occasionally just promote things without really thinking about it enough? Or saying, you know, some of you may disagree with this, or here's what I think perfection means. And part of it was surrounding, you know, preaching instantaneous perfection. There are people that I know that have come to faith basically in an instant. You know, their life was anything but in relationship with God, and something happened, and bam, there was this cosmic change in their being. But you know, that's a small percentage of people. If it happened to you, God bless you.
Yeah.
But most people, it's an ongoing struggle,
Right.
you know? It's the 2 steps forward and 1 step back kind of thing. Some days 2 steps forward, 3 steps back.
And sometimes you fall flat
On their face, yeah.
But does that instantaneous thing hold for them?
You know, it'd be interesting to be able to follow up. And I'm thinking revival preachers. You know, the old tent revivals. Set up, do this sermon that is very emotionally charged, do an altar call. You know, the worst sinner in town comes up and gives his life to Christ. And then they pack up the tent and move to a different town, and what happens to the worst sinner who gave his life to Christ? I can say that I've done events with young people where we took a bus, for example, to a Philadelphia 76ers game where they had a rally, faith rally afterwards. And They had a good speaker, an ex or retired baseball player named Pat Kelly, who played for the White Sox and the Orioles. And he gave a pretty emotional presentation, and kids were invited to come up, and we had a couple that went up. But that conversion was well past history by the time we got back on the bus.
Do you think that they were, if they showed any more emotion, that their fellow participants would make fun of them?
I think that part of it is that once you get the ball rolling, if you get a couple of brave people who are willing to go up, then others will go up too. Mm-hmm. Now, one of the great things about the Billy Graham Evangelistic Society was if you answered an altar call with Billy Graham, you were given a copy of the Gospel of John, but you were given a list of local churches in that area that they wanted to connect you to a local church. You weren't joining Billy Graham's church. You were local oriented. And I think that's something that, with some of the instantaneous conversions, people never connect. Because let's face it, being part of a church is a commitment. It's not, too often conversion is an emotional feeling. And the little bumper sticker, God said it, I believe it, that settles it. No, it doesn't settle a darn thing. What it basically says is you've had an emotional response and that you're saved, so you don't have to do a darn thing. The idea of Christians aren't perfect, just forgiven, doesn't cut it. We're not perfect, and we work at getting better. We put in effort in our faith. And I kind of take affront when I meet somebody for the first time and within their first 2 or 3 sentences, they ask if I'm saved. Listen, are you, number one, and what does that mean to you? We get this gift of salvation, and we understand that it is a gift. We haven't earned it. And that we receive this gift in spite of our sins because we believe that Jesus offers us the grace so that our sins don't cost us in the end. But then there has to be a response. And the response is discipleship. And I think there are some of these instantaneous things where they just never enter into a discipleship path.
Did John Wesley ever consider himself a disciple?
John Wesley probably considered himself more an apostle and a teacher of the faith. Because as we talked about a couple of sessions ago, Wesley struggled with his own faith journey. He wondered if he was saved. And we didn't talk about the Aldersgate experience, where, as he wrote in his journal, he went to a Bible study on Aldersgate Street, and he went reluctantly. And as he was there, somebody was reading the preface to Martin Luther's book on the Romans, and Wesley said, and my heart was strangely warmed, and I believed that God forgave my sins, even mine. But then if you look at Wesley's journal, a few weeks later, he's writing again about his doubts. When we look at perfection, was it something that Wesley was just obsessed with? Wesley wasn't obsessed with different things that maybe we might be tempted to be obsessed with, but he seemed to be obsessed with this perfectionism and the fact that he didn't have it. So,
There's one place where I thought I noted it, but I can't find it. He actually doubted that he even believed in God.
he doubted his belief at times, yeah.
Wow.
And it goes back maybe more to the psychological than the theological of, was Wesley spiritually disturbed? Are we, in a way, blessed to know that the father of the movement that we participate in had his struggles? Because we can relate, because we have our struggles. And if we can identify that Wesley had his struggles, then we can almost say to ourselves, well, it's okay if I do too. And I like that. I like the fact that Wesley questioned his own faith. Sometimes, when you meet somebody who is quite arrogant about being sure of their faith, you want to punch them right in the nose.
I have a thing with people believing that you have to be baptized as an adult in order to get to heaven, and I think they look down on people that are not baptized twice, and I just have an issue with that.
Yeah, the issue of believer baptism, there are proponents that, for example, in the Methodist Church, we accept anyone's baptism, no matter when it's been done or who did it. If you are Roman Catholic and convert to Methodism, you don't have to be baptized again. We don't baptize into the Methodist Church, we baptize into the Christian Church. Believer baptism, some do it as part of like confirmation. All of a sudden at age 13, you're expected to be able to speak to your faith and say, I'm committed to it, and therefore become eligible for baptism. Others, it's after having a spiritual experience. In the Methodist Church, we don't do rebaptism, we do affirmation of baptism, but make it very clear that this is not, you're not being rebaptized, because that would, in essence, indicate that the first baptism didn't work. Right? And again, so much comes down to symbolism. When I was doing my chaplaincy at Easton Hospital, if there was a baby born who was sickly and the parents were Roman Catholic, you got the priest out there ASAP. Because if they died unbaptized, they were going to hell. Well, that, you know, I sit and I think of that and I think, that doesn't sound like a loving God to me. You know, and is it really, again, you know, baptism is a welcome into the Christian family. And if you don't get baptized, does that mean, you know, your eternal punishment is, that just seems irrational.
You know what, when my granddaughter got baptized, I guess we didn't know the right time, or my daughter didn't know the right time, and we got to the church late, and her father-in-law was stepping in to be proxy for Caitlin's baptism.
Okay.
And I went like, what? You know, I just
I've never heard of that.
I couldn't believe it, because if it could, but it worked out. But we were, everybody was, Becca was, like my daughter was all upset about it. But yeah, the father-in-law was gonna stand in because the priest had to go somewhere, and it was done after the service,
Okay.
not during the service, which I thought they did it during the service, but they didn't.
Yeah.
And it, like 2 other babies were being baptized.
The one thing that I decline to do now is private baptism. I've done a couple. I wish I hadn't, because my understanding of baptism is that it is a welcome into the Christian church.
I wonder why they didn't baptize them during the service.
I don't think they do. I think
No,
it's-
usually Catholics are separate.
Well, then, yeah, you know,
Services.
when Austin had his, then Austin was later, and it was,
I know.
that was just weird.
I have a friend of mine who was baptized in Catholicism and joined a Presbyterian church, and they made her get rebaptized.
See, and that doesn't seem to make,
No.
No,
that's saying the first one didn't work.
yeah,
I know, that's like the church that Caitlin, I don't know what kind of church this is, but I told her, you were baptized. But her husband, I guess, I don't know if he was or not, but he just had the big baptism thing. He was, he sent out like a email thing that he got baptized with a, I don't even know if there was a picture, but I thought, is Caitlin gonna do that? You know?
Well, I
think so.
guess if somebody came to me and said, I want to be baptized again, I would say no.
Yeah.
Just because it doesn't make sense. Yeah.
but when you join the Baptist church, their creed is that you will have an immersion. And they don't waver on that.
Yeah.
They don't care whether you've been baptized before, you're coming into their church, and this is what they believe.
Yeah, and I think that that's one of those things where you just say, okay, you know, I'm not going to force my theology down your throat. But I am going to be true to mine.
So why don't you, there were people that went, I was Presbyterian, and she had 2 nephews that weren't brought up in the church, and they wanted to be baptized, but they didn't want to go, they were, you know, like adults almost, you know, and our minister wouldn't do it, and I don't know. I always wondered about that, so.
My belief is that baptism is God's gift to us. And so I don't require that people attend 8 weeks before there's a baptism or anything like that. But I see it as being an experience of the Christian church, not an individual experience. And
I don't know, I just thought they never came then.
the other thing would be, you know, in terms of private, is do you have a representative congregation present? You know, that is going to take the congregational vow to nurture the child in the Christian faith. If you have a bunch of people who have no intention whatsoever of being available to that child to nurture them in the faith, not saying they may take them to Little League games, they may babysit them, that's fine, but are they going to nurture them in the faith? If not, then that would seem like that part of the baptismal ritual is asking people to lie. And I'd hate to do that. I did one, there were like 4 people there. And I did it, and I got a call then maybe 2 years later from another family member who wanted me to do it again for somebody. I just said no. I'm sure there are people who will, but it's just not something I'm particularly comfortable with. You know, and I kind of live with that. So that's kind of it with Wesley. I mean, if you have the book, enjoy it. I mean, it's involved. But it is a fascinating look at a fascinating man who was very human in his life, and hopefully we are as inspired by his imperfections as his perfections, that it helps us along the way.
I think that his inspiration carries on years and years and years, only because, not so much of his doctrine, but the hymn writing.
Well, Charles certainly is the most prolific hymn writer in Christian history. In terms of lyrics, Charles would often use popular tunes to set his lyrics to. There are even a couple of hymns that probably were drinking songs that he appropriated for his purposes.
Don't tell the congregation
No.
now. Although, you know what, I've always found interesting, in one of my churches that I belong to, the choir director played an important part in the congregation and the messaging. And if there was a hymn that was going to be sung, she gave autobiography of the author, and the person did the music, the lyrics, and just background. And that's how I really came to love Fanny Crosby, knowing what she went through. And that was an interesting time to learn the history of hymns.
And that's something that if you are online, take your bulletin home and look up the hymns. And there's a website called Hymnary, but if you go in and type in hymnal number whatever, it'll bring it up and you can get the history behind
When
it.
we have had our hymn sings at church, Karen is like a walking encyclopedia with information about the hymns, the authors, you know, when it was written. Very, very informative she is.
Hymnody is fascinating. I mean, it really is a fascinating thing.
So what was, I found this paper, I don't know where I got it from, but what was the Holy Club?
That was in Oxford.
Oh, okay.
When the Wesley brothers were at Oxford, it was what morphed into Methodism. They called it the Holy Club.
Okay.
When they were first called Methodists, it was outsiders identifying them as a group that was very methodical in their faith. And the term Methodist at first was derogatory. The outsiders were accusing them of being Methodists. So Wesley didn't invent the term.
Oh, okay.
But the term ended up sticking. But the Holy Club, generally speaking, was no more than usually 6 or 8 people.
Yeah, there's a picture of it.
Okay, and they did a lot of work with the poor and then prison and things like that they would do. So they were kind of like a college fraternity. And that was the group. Maybe it's the point where Charles started writing hymns, was in the Holy Club. So they were very active, and it points to the fact that as our roots are very active in social ministry, feeding the poor, all that kind of stuff.
That's what I was thinking, I was reading it, but
Yeah,
that's what we do.
it's not a new idea.
There are so many, just riding around with my husband on the motorcycle, there are so many little tiny Methodist churches everywhere, like in the South too, and then there's just, there they are, and there's another one,
And
I can't read it.
it may be that we have to, for the sake of mission and ministry, restructure how we do things. Roman Catholicism, to a great degree, and its consolidation of parishes, has been healthy for them.
I think Mother Teresa had a big part in turning the Catholic Church into more giving in the community.
Well, and there was also St. Francis
Obviously,
was at the start. Those early Catholic missionaries were very socially oriented, and the nuns' orders certainly very involved in reaching out. I get a kick out of, because Jaden went to Immaculate Conception for a couple of years, and those Filipino nuns.
They're neat though.
They are.
Yeah.
They were so sweet, and it's like, it's kind of reverse evangelism. Or it used to be that America sent evangelistic teams overseas. Now, overseas are sending evangelistic teams to the United States.
There was a reading specialist that used to have to go up, because I worked at Penn Hall. So the nurse had to go up there, and the reading specialist, and he would always tell stories about him, and everything. I remember, and then at the end of the year, we'd all go out, and I remember they came to the galley one time in a limo. Somebody, that his kid, had a lot of money. They all came in. He goes, "Oh my God, the nuns are here." And then they're all the same size. They all had the little, not black, the gray. Yeah, and then they came in and ate, and they were fun. So
They're very sweet, very dedicated.
yeah.
That's for sure.
I have a question for you. When we start the next study, the book of John, will you have your messages on Sunday follow that thinking as well?
Well, we're ahead of it in terms of
I
Sundays.
know you are already.
Yeah, so
Yeah.
I don't think we will catch up. We'll see.
Okay.
we want to make sure that we cover the major themes in John and take a look at the timeline of John, because the timeline of John is different than the timeline of Matthew, Mark, and Luke. You know, for example, the turning over of the tables in the temple. In Matthew, Mark, and Luke, it's during Passover, right before Jesus is crucified. In John, it's like towards the beginning, the first trip to Jerusalem, not the last. So it's just there are differences in it that, and the theme, of course, in John, there are the signs, like the turning of water into wine. John is meant to point towards, it's more of an evangelistic book. It points towards wanting people to believe that Jesus was the Christ. In Matthew, Mark, and Luke, we have it in Mark especially, we have the messianic secret, where Jesus would do things and then tell the disciples they couldn't tell anybody. And whatever that means. When they had the transfiguration event and Moses and Elijah appear with Jesus, he then, as on the way down the mountain, tells James and John, you can't say anything. Or Peter and John, you can't say anything.
Is you thinking that the book of John professes more of the love of Christ than the other books?
Mhm.
That's what I'm
Yeah.
thinking.
It will offer that Jesus is given the right to judge, but simply if you look at John 3:16, yeah, that's the intent, that through belief we may have everlasting life. The negative to that is some people stop there, and like we said earlier, they don't really do anything with their faith then. They just believe and feel that's enough. You know, when I run into people who are totally anti-organized religion, and they say, well, you know, I believe in God, but I don't believe in organized religion. I want to ask, well, how do you fellowship with other Christians? How do you support missions? You know, other Christian missions? How do you nurture your discipleship? If I want to be judgmental, and sometimes I do.
That's okay, you're forgiven.
You know, the statement, I'm spiritual but not religious, what does that mean? You know, I don't know. Yeah, it's kind of innocuous.
It's a lost soul.
Yeah, I don't know. But, you know, what I do know is that my spirituality has found a home in organized religion, and that because of that, I have the opportunity to be nurtured and to hopefully nurture others, and that I have the opportunity to be in fellowship with fellow believers and do good things in the world.
Amen.
And that's
Yeah, amen.
good enough. So, but yeah, we'll resume June 10th. If you want to jump ahead, simply start reading the book of John. We're going to initially take it a chapter a week, and then it speeds up a little. There are more chapters that kind of go together as the book goes on. But we We start with, in the beginning was the Word, and the Word was God, and the Word was, and that certainly is one of the trickier chapters, so we start with that. And then move on to, there's the turning the water into wine at the wedding, and Nicodemus comes to Jesus by night, and the healing of the centurion, and centurion's son, and it goes on and on. But
Jane, there's a beautiful anthem you guys should consider for the book of John 3, and it's God So Loved the World. It's a beautiful anthem, if you can find it.
Julie's
Okay.
good at
Looking
looking
at-
up. I'm on it.
I'm sure you saw it.
yeah, I think there's more than one. I'm not sure which one. The one I know is God so loved the world.
That's the one I know.
God so loved the world.
Oh,
He
yeah.
gave His only begotten Son.
Didn't you see that?
Somebody, one of my churches sang it. I don't know if it was this one or not.
Okay.
Check
It's a beautiful anthem. It really
Yeah.
is.
So we certainly want to invite you all back. Again, it's something that if you need to miss a week, don't feel bad. It's summer. I'm sure that everyone will be jetting off to various ports of call.